Putin and the Kremlin have made it very illegal for Russians to speak out against the Ukraine war. But is Google Trends revealing what Russians really think and feel about the conflict? And just what is Russia doing about people getting a little too much free thinking? Insight from Ukraine and Russia has all of that. We're going to be breaking it down right now. Let's get into it. Real militaries rely on war games to test their weapons, tactics, and systems. From the squad to the brigade, war games are a low-risk way to test a unit. However, for us, war games can be a way to test our mind and our mettle. That's why I wanted to talk about today's sponsor, Conflict of Nations. Conflict of Nations is a free-to-play online PvP strategy game set in a modern global conflict. It's a massive game with up to 128 players competing in wars that can go on for weeks. It's up to you to decide if you are going to build alliances or antagonize your rivals. And like real war, you need to build and research the right military for your strategy. You can build tanks, nuclear submarines, aircraft, and more. One thing I think is awesome is that it is cross-compatible on PC and mobile, so you can play on the same account whether you're at home on your PC or slacking off at work. And for the next 30 days, Conflict of Nations is offering a massive sign-up bonus. Click the link in the description to download Conflict of Nations and get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free.
You can street interview Russians, hold them, read their comments online, watch their actions, but it doesn't really give you the whole picture of what's going on inside their heads, what they are planning to do, and how they actually feel about their country invading Ukraine. In this video, you'll see the data that doesn't lie. It's the data from Google that shows how often Russians Google different things. I found some interesting trends that clearly show that there are changes inside the Russian society due to the war. For example, the Russian army is clearly getting bigger since the interest in payment for participating in the war is at an all-time high level, and there is a visible strong upward trend.
So here, this is really interesting. I actually suspect that some of these variations would likely reflect the dates of the month when payments are supposed to arrive. Because remember, they're Googling payments for the SMO, and I think his idea is to say, oh, how much will I earn for serving in this SMO? But what I think is also likely is the real question is, where is my payment for the SMO? Or is this a sufficient payment based on my service there? Because that's something we've heard a lot. And so I suspect there's a spike every, let's say they're paid on the 1st or the 15th of the month. Then there might be a spike on the 15th of the month as more and more soldiers ask, hey, dude, where's my money? Especially over the last year, where we know that the Russian government is spending an astronomical amount of money funding this war. They've actually raised a lot of, raised the compensation primarily to attract more impoverished Russians and more foreign nationals for whom the Russian ruble looks very, very lucrative.
Even worse is that many Russians buy into promises of a rich life, and they are willingly signing contracts to join the invasion force.
Okay, this trend upward is insane to me because as of January of this year, you might recall the Russian military took an astronomical amount of casualties in Avdiivka. And it looks like around that time, as more people knew or heard about individuals who were killed or grievously wounded in the war, there might have been less interest. But then there's this huge spike in interest. In fact, it was near an all-time high. And that is kind of interesting. What's also interesting to me is the location. You see there at the bottom, it says that the interest over time is concentrated in Tuva. And while I'm not sure much about Tuva Oblast, Oblast, it is interesting in that, first off, it looks like it is in one of the more impoverished regions of central Russia. You can see over here is kind of the St. Petersburg, Finland area. This is deep in central Russia. And it seems like its economy it has more unemployment than a typical, than the Russian average. And it seems like it is primarily a mining town. You can see you're looking at people who are traditionally like yurt-dwelling nomads, so very, very Mongolian. And you definitely are kind of left with this vibe looking around that this is a poor area, right? We're gonna see if we can find right, the Tuva GDP here, but it seems like an area that we think of as really really an impoverished region. And here we go. Here's actually a list of Russian federal subjects or oblasts by GDP, and you could see that you have to go way down here to find Tuva. Let's see if we can even find it here. Tuva, Republic of Tuva, appears to be, this is exactly what we'd expect, right? Tuva, one of the most impoverished regions in all of Russia, literally other than areas with active insurgencies like South Ossetia, Dagestan, Chechnya. Tuva is one of the most impoverished. So it makes sense that that serving in the SMO feels like a good idea to those sort of Russians. And it's a really, really it holds very little appeal, right, to earn that kind of impoverished SMO level pay if you're in one of these wealthier than average oblasts. But man, if you're in Tuva, I bet that SMO looks really good.
On this chart, it looks like they started doing so only for...
Oh, the next one is the Altai Republic. Let's see how that is. That's the second most, at almost 96% of the level. Oh, we don't have to look that hard. Here's Altai. Altai Republic, 66th most impoverished. And so I think this is the fact that Russia knows that its recruitment efforts are going to be most successful in impoverished areas. And it aligns with what we've seen, which is Russia recruiting ethnic and linguistic minorities as well as impoverished Russians.
From spring of 2023, but if I change the keyword to sign the contract, which in Russian usually refers to military contract, then you'll see that the interest in military service steadily growing with huge spikes at the beginning of the invasion. And when
Number one, Tuva. Again, likely these guys are impoverished. They are serving as conscripts, and then they get told, hey, if you want, you can earn a lot of money by Tuva standards by serving in the Russian SMO. And it looks pretty appealing if the alternative is, again, a career in the growing field of mining.
And the mobilization in Russia was announced. So yeah, this looks bad. It doesn't seem like Russia will run out of men anytime soon if we judge only these keyword stats. And what if we check how often Russians wondering when the war will end? There are also huge spikes around the beginning of the war and mobilization, but on this particular chart, it doesn't look like the interest in the end of the war is growing. But it's...
Here's two interesting factoids. One is in Chukotka, autonomous, and then Belgorod, which is interesting because we know that Belgorod is the site of a where the Freedom of Russia Legion has done a bunch of cross-border raids. And that would make sense, right? That you're going to see Russians be much more concerned about when the war will end in areas where the war feels like proximate.
It's not quite true. The thing is that people in Russia fear using the term war because it's basically illegal to do so. So they Google special military operation instead. And so by looking at that chart, it does look like many Russians want this to be over soon. But I don't want to give you...
You can see also these local spikes, likely again driven by Belgorod, that really are probably driven by Russians who again are feeling the war in a visceral way.
False hopes. If you check the comparison between two opposing groups of Russians, those who want the invasion to stop and those who want to participate in it, we'll see that the wannabe soldiers outnumbered the peace seekers. Of course, it's a bad news. Though I suspect that the situation would have been different if we could see the data from all.
Some of those guys are likely, I don't think these are two opposed terms, right? You sign the contract and then you ask, when is this going to be over? Because a lot of these contracts appear to be for the duration of the SMO or until wounded. So you can see literally somebody spike here, so they sign the contract, then there's a spike asking, when will it be over?
All the Russians around the world, not only those who live in Russia currently. And I suspect that many already left Russia since the interest in emigration is dropping significantly. It's not quite seen on this chart.
But look at this. What have we talked about, right? St. Petersburg and Moscow are the two largest areas looking at emigration from Russia. Again, you're looking at a sort of bifurcation of Russian society where a cosmopolitan upper middle class and middle class Russians who really identify more strongly with Europe. They are the ones who are kind of mortified by this war and are looking to get out, whereas you have rural Russians in more traditional societies where there's a lot more poverty. They look at the SMO as an opportunity to make some money. So a real interesting contrast. Again, you couldn't be more different between St. Petersburg, Moscow, and places like Tuva.
Chart, but if you look at interest in the exchange rate of 1 ruble to Kazakhstan tenge, we'll see that Russians have become less interested in it either because they no longer want to leave to Kazakhstan.
Interesting that they consider Kazakhstan a destination. Again, I think cosmopolitan Russians likely would not want to go to Kazakhstan. I think they would be much more likely to try to go to other European countries. I'd be curious to know, I wonder if he'll cover the Russian ruble to the euro.
Kazakhstan, or maybe because they already left.
And you can see these oblasts are Kazakhstan adjacent.
I don't know why, but there is definitely something going on in Russia economically. The interest in withdrawing money is significantly higher even compared to the beginning of the war.
And this is something we've talked about earlier, where Russia's economic policy, they have to fund this war somehow. And to do so, they're increasingly relying on, somewhat selling oil, somewhat taxes, but then also on money printing. And so what they're likely withdrawing money is for two reasons. One is cash transactions are harder to trace and track. So a lot of their services may sit there and say, hey, we give a pretty big cash discount because tax rates are rising. And it kind of correlates actually with the Russian announcement of rising taxes. So as they've introduced new taxes, more people want to pay in cash and not have to report their transactions to the central government. You also have people who may want to convert their rubles into other assets and again, not make it a taxable event. So they likely may want to withdraw money and purchase, for example, euros, something that again, was traditionally done digitally on a Moscow exchange and now has been decentralized. And that's also maybe part of this is that decentralization of the Russian exchange rate. But that's primarily for banks. I don't think it's for individuals. I think an individual would still go to a money changer. So I don't think that explanation is the most likely.
When everything was so uncertain, I suspect it has something to do with Putin's re-election. Probably for a large part of the Russian population, it was a signal that they shouldn't expect anything good from it. And they definitely feel more anxious right now than they ever felt for the past 5 years. They Google anxiety abnormally too often lately. And it's clear that the trend is only going up after.
That is really unusual to have this a total spike, basically driven by St. Petersburg and the Sakha Republic. And it's weird that it spikes and kind of is remaining high. Really bizarre stuff, actually. This is probably the most bizarre. Very, very intriguing.
The coronavirus and the start of the invasion. Speaking of what...
Yeah, note here, that's a good point. Literally, there was less anxiety around COVID than there is around sort of the current state of things. again, possibly driven in part by the SMO, part by Russian government policies and changes. But again, sort of strange that it's driven heavily by St. Petersburg.
What Russians truly feel, I suspect that the big chunk of Russian society has been depressed after the invasion began. I'm not a doctor, but let me just show you some facts. Russians Google pills more often than they were Googling them during the pandemic. If you think that it's a
Pills is a little generic. You may want to search, if you're looking for mental health stuff, you may want to say things like antidepressants, SSRI, because again, you're not going to Google pills. Like, that's not going to tell you anything, which instead it may tell you what you want to know is specific medications that are used to treat conditions, right? Because when your doctor says, hey, I'm going to prescribe you this thing for your depression, right, and you've never heard of it before, it's some multi-syllable name, people are going to go home and they're going to search it on Google. They're going to say, what does this do? What are the side effects? What did my doctor give me? Again, in the US, at least, I think in a lot of countries where there's kind of a doctor shortage, your visits with your doctor could be quick and you may not get all the information that you wanted to get about the treatment that you're receiving. So I would Google specific treatments like SSRI or its Russian equivalent.
The global trend, here's how the pills trend looks like in the US. It's actually going down. Now, what kind of pills are becoming popular in Russia throughout this war? First of all, it's the pills from headache. There is a steady upward trend, but there is also a high demand for pills from high blood pressure.
Okay, the headache is interesting because we know that one of the most common injuries in kind of this war and concussive wars that involve a lot of explosives is headaches, head injuries. And oftentimes TBIs, traumatic brain injuries, as the US knows, they cause persistent chronic headaches due to the damage to the brain. And so I think you're likely to see, as more of these veterans come home, you're going to see more and more of these chronic conditions like chronic headaches.
So one of the not so obvious consequences of this.
Very interesting to see this sort of trend. Look at this, a very clear seasonal loop. And I wonder if it has something to do with the daylight hours, if somehow getting fewer hours of daylight corresponds to high blood pressure. Alcohol use also linked to high blood pressure. So you could have people who are shut up indoors, they get limited daylight, they drink a lot, their blood pressure rises, and they get a prescription from their doctor.
War is that Russian society becomes more unhealthy, anxious, and depressed. One of the signs of depression is sleepiness and the lack of energy. And guess what? Russians have been very sleepy for the past 2.5 years, even more so than...
Interesting. And look at this, Tuva. Here's another theory if you want it. It's not so much that Russians are sleepy, especially if it's being led by Tuva, a land. Remember, if they're recruiting a lot of people, it's highly likely that they're also returning a lot of people. And so if you saw combat, PTSD symptoms, right, definitely include sleepiness, but also an inability to sleep, insomnia. So you feel exhausted, but you cannot downshift your central nervous system. It's on too high alert all the time. And combine that, again, with high stress or chronic stress, and then you again, have head injuries producing headaches, which can in turn exacerbate other PTSD symptoms. So I think when I see this, especially if it's an area with one of the largest cohorts of SMO fighters, where they're drawing these fighters from, I look at this and I see increasing numbers of soldiers returning with PTSD.
During the pandemic, let's dig even deeper. Depressed people care less about the way they look. So let's see how often Russians Google makeup. You see that the interest declined over the course of the war. And what about sports?
Okay, so this new theory, again, Russia is subject to sanctions. You're going to have imports are going to become more expensive, especially if Russia is printing money, as it is. The current interest rate in Russia around 17%. So certainly they are trying to pump or trying to combat very, very high inflation. And that would mean that foreign produced goods are more expensive. And so if this makeup is made overseas, again, Moscow, St. Petersburg, you're likely to get kind of Western makeup brands. They may simply have less interest because makeup is more unaffordable.
The same story here. People aren't as interested in sports as they were before this war. Also, it might be related to the fact that Russia was banned from many sport competitions because of the war. And
yeah, interesting to see it in Kaliningrad and Murmansk. Another theory would be that where if you're a Russian military recruiter, where are you likely to find able-bodied men? In sports clubs and sports camps. So it's likely that actually the population of Russians capable of playing sports might be diminishing, and that may be a reflection of this, right? So you can see that once the war pops off, there's a sudden drop in military in people physically capable enough to participate in sport. And again, primarily probably able-bodied men. And so that may be why you're seeing this reduction.
What about bad habits and addictions? Depressed people tend to fall for them more oftenly. Yep, it seems Russians have become gamblers. Obviously, many of them deal with depression in old Soviet manner by drinking hard liquor, which led to some...
Okay, wait. Let's back this up. I want to take one look at the casino thing. Again, all this says, this is a sign of an inflationary crisis, a growing inflationary crisis, because you can see that the Russian ruble actually had early in the war, the Russian ruble became really devalued, and then it sort of steadily has been losing value since then, right? Let's see if we can find let's see if I can find the ruble to USD exchange rates. Let's see if we can find a chart. Oh, beautiful. Thank you, Google. Okay, let's pull this up here. And here's the 5-year chart. So you can see, boom, there's this spike here, right? Where the Russian ruble, as soon as the war starts, the Russian ruble value tanks, it spikes, and then begins to lose value again. And now plot this against this here. You see a spike in gambling, and then it sort of diminishes and then steadily begins to lose value again. Again, it's almost a perfect inverse of the exchange rate. I wonder if I can make this bigger. Please become bigger. Google Finance. There we go. That's what I want. Yeah, you see a spike and then a steady decline followed by a decline followed by a rise again. So remember, invert this for the gambling. Because remember, people go to the casino, they're like, shit, I don't have enough money. Or the appeal of striking it big at a casino feels better. It's more appealing when you are getting squeezed in all ends, right? Again, if you're making great money, now there's gambling addicts who will burn all their money no matter what. But again, when you're broke, and you see, again, look at the number one people searching this, Tuva, one of the most impoverished Russian oblasts. Likely it's very impoverished and probably has a lot of casinos. So you're looking at, again, people who experience a quick devaluation of the ruble. If the ruble value slowly begins to stabilize, they feel like they're making ends meet. And then slowly we've seen the ruble lose value, and the chance to strike it big at a casino looks more and more appealing.
By drinking hard liquor, which led to some of them asking Google on how to stop drinking. Maybe that's also the reason why Russians Google the pills from headaches so much. And another reason why Russians are so anxious lately is because Russia isn't safe due to convicts being released from the war and from prisons. Also due...
See, quit drinking has actually risen worldwide. He doesn't realize. But here's the funny thing. Look, the search term is worldwide. Quit drinking, number one country on earth is Russia, followed closely by Turkmenistan, which is fascinating. But as we've talked about on this channel, Russia's a country where something like 1 in 3 or 1 in 2 men are alcoholics, meet the clinical definition for alcoholism. So it makes sense that Russians would steadily want to quit drinking, or rather that Russia would lead the world in people trying to quit drinking.
to terrorist attacks and just due to the war. Probably that's the reason why so many Russians have been interested in purchasing pepper spray lately. So what we have here is a divided society. Z-lovers eager to...
Again, Moscow, St. Petersburg, highest concentration of people who are interested in this kind of self-defense stuff. But again, I think this may reflect some element of a Russian inflation crisis. Because again, when each dollar is worth less, crime, petty crime, starts to look more and more appealing, right? We've all seen this in the United States over the last 3 or 4 years, whereas inflation has crept up, so has property crime. Individuals breaking into cars, for example, and stealing the goods within them. And it's not like criminals are all cold and calculating, but the pressure, they're still human beings, and they feel the economic pressure squeezing them, and they look at something like an iPhone sitting on a seat, left on a seat, and they may say, hey, this looks more appealing given the fact that I need cash worse than ever, and this durable good might actually sell for more than ever. Again, inflation means the price of everything goes up, including used goods and services. So the appeal of stealing is actually rising considerably.
Join meat grinder and just regular people who sick of the war, feels anxious and depressed, who became addicted and less healthy and less interested in life in general. That's
ding, ding, ding. See, buying and selling dollars, these are two transactions that you would need to do in order to facilitate in order to stabilize yourself to a currency that's slowly losing value. And you can see, again, early war, value of the ruble tanked, and then it's slowly stabilized, and now it's starting to rise again. And you notice buying dollars, this correlates again with the shift in Russian economic policy, banning dollar exchanges. Let's see if I can find the exact date. I think it's here. There you go. This was in June 14th. Russia is holding off on dollar and euro trading altogether as a new round of sanctions kick in, June 14th, 2024. So and again, this is talking about like large-scale economic policy shifts, but you see that timing is just about right. And probably a lot of people saw this news in Russia and were like, I should buy dollars because it's coming for us.
The price they pay for being silent observers of their country becoming a terrorist state. That's it for today's video. If you found it interesting, please smash the like button.
Yeah, do check him out. I'm going to link to him in the description. You should definitely like his channel, become a member. It's absolutely worth it. Yeah, I hope he's doing well. Glad he's back. And certainly, I think the takeaway here for us anyway is that the Russian people, like, there's a lot more evidence that the Russian people, I think it's less about depression and more about the economic squeeze, right? When you have this kind of very expensive war, particularly a war of choice that that a lot of Russians, the only way they feel the war is the economic pressure that's slowly cooking Russia. And I think that is ultimately one of the things that is more likely to end the war against Putin is simply the Russian people getting fed up with high prices, brutal sanctions, and a ruble that's worth less and less and less. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Huge thank you to today's sponsor. I'll see you in the next one. Conflict of Nations is a free-to-play PvP strategy game set in a modern global conflict. Choose your strategy and fight massive battles all over the world. For the next 30 days, Conflict of Nations is offering a massive, exclusive sign-up bonus. 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. So click the link in the description, choose your country, and fight your way to victory.